kind of something concerning the philosophical or conceptual process with existence, being, event, finality, subject, truth, and so on. To lecture by me of a text which is not the text you have, but another text that you will have too. And after that, the discussion of questions. Okay. So we have said this morning that the process, the philosophical process, which is really a process with different steps, different constructions, different conceptual constructions, and so on, and which is not the immediate intuition of the infinite into mystic experience, begins by something of ontological nature, existence, being, and at the end we have truth, and we have event, fidelity, subject. All that can be different in some different languages, different conception, different invention, so on. That is my proper language, but we find all that in every philosophical system. Sometimes with a change of order or a change of accent and so on. And I can explain two differences, two details. First, the beginning is something ontological, that is something concerning being and or existence, or the two concepts. We can say that the beginning, in fact, is a situation. We can use that sort of word which is indeterminate. All process begins in a situation, a concrete situation. And this situation can be solved from the point of view of being or from the point of view of existence. In fact, the situation is the situation. There is a unity of the situation, at the beginning of something of creative nature. So we can say that the beginning is a concrete situation, but at the philosophical level, situation has two possible meanings. First, a purely ontological one, so the situation is the being of the situation, or from the point of view of appearance, from the point of view of what really exists in the situation. You know? And we have seen before that precisely the dialectical nature of philosophy is always to think the difference between being and existence. All that to say that there is in the philosophical field two different interpretations or different analysis, philosophical analysis of the sequence. The sequence, ontology, event, finality, subject, truth. There is two different thinking of all that. First, from the point of view of being as such, so the situation is part or is sought in its being, or for the point of view of existence, that is from the point of view of appearance, what exists, what appears in a world. A clear example is in Hegel. In Hegel, we have two great books, one phenomenology and the other logic. It's clear that the logic of Hegel is the question of truth from the point of view of being as such. And the beginning of the logic, of the Hegel's logic, is purely the completely void concept of being as such. We begin with being. And phenomenology, the other book of Hegel, is from the point of view of existence and from the point of view of consciousness. It's another. Finally, the two books are not at all a contradiction. With the two books, we have two different interpretations of the construction of a truth. First, from the point of view of pure being, and second, from the point of view of historical existence, specificity of the world, and history of consciousness. But this distinction is a very general distinction. For example, in Plato, we can see the same thing. A book that, like the Parmenides, is from the point of view of being, absolutely. But a book like, for example, Socrates' Apology or something like that, is from the point of view of concrete existence. But the question is the same. The question is not a different question. It's always the question of, finally, of the question of immanent exception. So the question of what is the truth. And it is why the distinction between pure being and appearance or existence is also a methodological difference in philosophy. It's not only an ontological difference, but it's also a difference in the writing of philosophy. There are two forms of writing in philosophy. And when you write concerning existence, very often your writing, your style, and so on, is not the same. But in the case of beginning in pure being. You can say something like that. In the case of the beginning by pure being, the writing is very logical, strict, and near mathematics. If the beginning is on the side of concrete world, existence, consciousness, the writing is much more like a novel, like a philosophical novel, like the story of the truth in a concrete world. And this distinction is not a contradiction, but creates probably in the complete history of philosophy two tendencies, two obscure tendencies, but real. We have philosophers who prefer the beginning by concrete world and existence and so on. We can name them existentialists in some sense. But existentialism exists from the very beginning of philosophy. And there is another tendency which prefer the beginning by pure being. And we can name this tendency an essentialist tendency, existentialist against essentialist. But every great philosopher is the two, very often with difference of extension, difference. The preference exists always, but the distinction is also the distinction in Heidegger between being and being. You know, être et étant. But the English language is not an ontological language. You know, the great English philosophical tradition is empiricism. The creation is the great important say, it's empiricism, the creation of Hume and so on, Locke. And in empiricism, the idea is that we have to propose the hypothesis that there is no difference between existence and being. That what we see, what exists in the world, is really what exists absolutely. There is nothing behind the appearance. We have all what exists is our experience, finally. All what is in our experience exists and also is. In fact, in every great attempt to be a rigorous empiricist, we recognize at the end something which is of ontological nature. Because in fact, it's impossible to develop a consistent philosophy which would be strictly empiricist. Maybe a sort of positivism, so a sort of attempt of thinking outside philosophy. There is the ontological part in Hume and in all the great empiricist tradition in England. But the idea is that there is no difference. It is why sometimes we cannot translate philosophical notion in English. Some French distinction on the side of the subjectivity, to begin by the subject, which is a French word, not an English word. In English was the self, not rigorously, not the subject. So it's on the side of French philosophy, and on the side of ontological philosophy, German philosophy, and so on, is much more a difficulty concerning ontological concept. And so the distinction between what exists and between to exist and to be is very difficult to understand in complete consequences in English language. And when we must translate the German present participe étant and infinitive to be, we cannot translate in English. It's impossible. So generally, the solution is to name what is being with a big B and what exists with a small b. Être étant. And so you see that the language is always a symptom, because on the side of to be, we have a big B. So there is a recognition in language of something more majestuous or more important on the side. But the real tendency is also to say that this very majestuous Gehring, in fact, is nothing at all. And so it's a big B for the thing, in the real empiricist tradition in English. And we have only the small b, which is the real, that is finally what exists. But you know, all that is the history of what Heidegger has named the ontological difference. It's the name, Heideggerian name of all that, the ontological difference. And for Heidegger, all the history of philosophy is in fact the history of ontological difference. There is a history of that sort of distance between to be and to exist. And it is why it's a central concept in the philosophy of Heidegger, but in fact, it's a central concept in every philosophy, that sort of difference. And it is why Heidegger is a great historian of philosophy, because the interpretation of all the history of philosophy by Heidegger is really consistent with, as a sort of line, a sort of consistent vision, the ontological difference between to be and to exist. So, we have not only one sequence of concepts from ontology to epistemology, from ontology to question of truth, to the question of being to the question of truth, but we have also in the same philosophy two possible interpretations of this sequence. The interpretation purely ontological and the interpretation with, at its beginning, much more appearance and existence. And it's sometimes named in the form of the opposition of a dogmatic philosophy, which is a philosophy of being, and an empirist philosophy, an empiricist philosophy, which is precisely a philosophy of existence. But I repeat, every attempt to construct a philosophical system is always a mixture of the two interpretations. Simply, sometimes the beginning is much more on the side of empiricism, and sometimes the beginning is much more on the side of ontology. But finally, we can always interpret philosophy as an interdependency between the two interpretations. And it's why the lecture, the reading of philosophy is practically always divided. It's not. It's very difficult to unify completely the lecture, the reading and the interpretation of philosophy. Not only because we have great tensions between particularité and universalité, not only because we have the question of the experience, the nihilist experience of nothingness, and after that the construction of affirmation, not only because philosophy is something which is impure in the language and so on, but also because there is two possible beginnings, in fact. There is two possible beginnings in any treatise of philosophy or any philosophical construction. And so we have always the question of the relationship between the two, and the reason for the choice of one beginning much more than the other possible beginning. And all that is a subjective choice, in fact. It's a subjective choice, and why we find the possible beginning on the side of existence, or the possible beginning on the side of being, all along the history of philosophy. It's not the passage, the historical passage to one beginning to another beginning, no. It's really the question of a subjective choice between the two beginnings. And so there is really a sort of rhythm with two times between empiricism and dogmatism. And what is the nature of this choice? When in fact the philosopher, and finally everybody who reads philosophy and so on, why we prefer that sort of beginning? I think that we prefer because there is different manners to confront ourselves to the primitive experience of nihilism. That is the point. The relationship to, because, you know, the experience of nihilism, of nothingness, is really a purely subjective one. It's really an experience. It's not something which is of conceptual nature. So, the difference of subjectivity is also a difference of the nature of this experience. And I say, sometimes the nihilist experience is really a form of very hard anxiety. We recognize that sort of experience in the style of the philosopher. And sometimes it's a terrible experience. And the philosophy is also something like a means to escape the experience. The experience is a necessity. But if the experience is a terrible thing, we have the desire to escape quickly and not to stay in nihilism. And it's a first time. When if we read precisely the circumstances of the life of the philosopher and so on, you can see something like that. Certainly, the negative experience of negativity is a necessity, but we must go beyond as quickly as possible. It's the first possibility. Generally, that sort of philosophy prefer the beginning on the side of being, because not too much existence. Because the existence was completely on the side of anxiety. And so that sort of philosophy is a philosophy which is really a philosophy not exactly against, but really completely beyond the primitive experience of negativity. We must go as quickly as possible to affirmation. And there is another form of philosophy where it's on the contrary, the experience of negativity is a temptation. Something which is like a measure of the potency of life. The potency of life in the form maybe of the dead drive, but something which is really an experience of the limits of life. And so that sort of experience is a temptation, and the philosopher don't go beyond that sort of experience quickly. But the description of experience, the consequences of experience, the very nature of experience takes a large place in the philosophical disposition. It's not just a point. For example, I return to the example of Descartes. Descartes is typically of the first tendency. There is precise description in Descartes of the negative character of the duped, of the possibility in the duped of a complete nihilism, of a complete destruction of possible knowledge. But quickly we are going to the first affirmation. Okay, there is a duped, a total duped, a possibility of a duped, mathematics included in duped and so on. All that is possible, but this possibility finally go to the first affirmation of the pure being of subjectivity as such. But naturally, if you take Kierkegaard or even Nietzsche, you find on the contrary a very long description and great importance of the experience of negativity, of the existential experience of negativity. And if you take, for example, Schopenhauer, you find a philosophy which develops the description of anxiety, suffering, and so on, as a very long and important part of the philosophical disposition. And I think that, so to return to the question, I think that the two possible beginnings on the two necessary sides of philosophy, the side of being and the side of existence, is really of biographical nature. It's really a purely subjective one. And you know, it's Nietzsche has written that the philosophy is the biography of the philosopher. That is finally the philosophy with concept and so on, but at the end, for Nietzsche, it is the story of the life of the philosopher. Like often in Nietzsche, it's not absolutely true, but it's not absolutely false. Not absolutely false. There really exist some subjective biographical elements in conceptual philosophy, and we must accept that sort of dimension. And so it's impossible to reduce the figure of the philosopher to the figure of the scientist, for example. Certainly, the goal in any case is to find something universal. But in the scientific result, the life of the scientist disappears. We can know that Einstein and so on, you know the life of a great scientist and so on, but in the result, in the text, in the book, in the theorem, in the laws of physics and so on, all biographical elements disappear. So the figure of the scientist is the figure of disparition of subjectivity, not absence of subjectivity, because there is a concrete situation and a concrete scientist. But the work itself organizes the disparition of subjectivity. And in philosophy, it's impossible. In philosophy, the subjectivity of the philosopher cannot completely disappear. And so it's true, in some sense, that there is always something biographical in a philosophy. And the most important symptom is the choice of the beginning. The choice of the beginning on the side of existence or on the side of being. It's the most important symptom of the very subjective nature of philosophy. So after that, I return to my case. You know, I have written two big books of philosophy. The first is Being an Event. And the second is Logical. And really you can see immediately that the first one is on the side of being, and the second one by the world on the side of appearance or existence. And it is a case. And I just say to you how, from my proper experience, I see the difference. I see the difference. The difference of the two books. Being an Event, 1988, Logical World, 2005, 6. So, if there is always something biographical in the philosophy, I expose some biographical elements concerning the difference of the two books, some subjective implications. The first book is really under the question of what is exactly the possible understanding of the being of a truth. What is the being of a truth? If a truth is really something like an immanent exception, how the truth is different from the point of view of the general laws of being. No. So it's clearly on the side of being as a question of what is the truth. Not how a truth can exist, but what is the being of a truth in the supposition that something like a truth exists. And when I was writing this book concerning, finally, the being of the truth, the great question was the order of concepts. And it was what I can name a constructive subjectivity. Constructive subjectivity. And why the question of the order of concepts is the first question? Because, naturally, truth comes at the end of the process. Being, event, fidelity, subject, truth. So, if you want to understand what is the being of the truth, you have to go to your conception of being, to your conception of truth, under the same question, the question of being itself. And so we have to explore the question of being as such. What is the being of an event? What is the being of a fidelity? What is the being of a subject? And finally, what is the being of a truth? The question of order is essential. If we don't, we don't respect the order, something of the very nature of the question disappears. Because you lost the question of being. And you are finally the question of the existence of truth, and not of in the question of the existence, historical existence of truth, by subject, after fidelity, in consequence of an event, and so on. But you have not the question of, finally, what is the being of the truth? And it was a very complex question, because generally, the question of being of truth is not an immanent question. In classical metaphysics, in a big part of history of philosophy, and in Heidegger too, the question of the being of truth is not exactly the question of its being, but practically always the question of its existence. It's clear, the great discussion between scepticism and dogmatic philosophy is the question of existence of truth. Is it possible to know something like a truth? Or is it possible to know the truth? And you see, in that sort of field, we have the concept of the truth, to know the truth. Possibility or impossibility to know the truth. And generally, truth is something absolute. And the possibility or impossibility to know the truth is also the possibility or impossibility to know something absolute. But this discussion is a discussion concerning existence of truth, and not a discussion concerning being of truth. It's an example of the distance between the two. And there is, and on the other side, in the context of the 80s, because the book is 1888, in the context of the 18, the question of truth was always reduced to a linguistic question. It was the dominant current. Is it possible for a proposition in the language to be true? What is the correct language to produce sentences which are true, and so on? And so the question of truth was the question of truth of a proposition, of a judgment. But my vision of what is the truth was not at all that sort of vision. For me, a truth can be a work of art, political revolution, scientific theory, and so on, great law, and it's not reducible to the strict question of the truth of a judgment. My question is not like what I am saying when I say the snow is the snow is white. It's an analytic question, typical analytic question. Why the judgment the snow is white is true, and what I am saying when I say that the judgment, the sentence, the snow is white is true, and so on. It was the context, the dominant context. The dominant context was the reduction of the question of truths, not to the question of what is a universal creation in a culture, but to the question of a judgment, of a sentence, of a proposition. So the truth was a linguistic question, and not at all an ontological one. So I wrote Being an Event in a complete different context, where the question of truth was not at all the question of being of a truth, but the question of what is a correct proposition, a correct sentence. So we can say that it was the conception, a grammatical conception of truth, or if you want, a purely logical conception of truth. And so, in that sort of context, it was an obligation for me to be extremely strict in the order of the book and in construction, and to give to the book the form of something like a big proof, a big demonstration of the validity, first of my definition of what is the truth, and more important, of the question of the being of truth, and to fight against the pure reduction of the notion of truth to linguistic problem. And it is why this book, subjectively, has two characteristics. First, it's a book where the order is a constructive order, which reflects my constructive subjectivity, to be perfect in the order of concepts. And second is also a fighting book against the dominant context, which was in fact a sort of victory in France during these years of the analytic point of view, in fact, the academic domination of analytic point of view, Americanization of France. You know, France is Americanized generally with 20 years after. And it was okay because, in some sense, purely analytical philosophy was finished in the United States when it was victorious in France. And so, sort of historical paradox in the situation. But in some sense, I was like Don Quixote. I was fighting against Moulin à Vent, je sais pas. But it was the situation. It was my situation. It was my subjectivity. And so, Being Event is a book of a very strict nature, which I was also saying to my enemies that on the side of logic and mathematics, I was perfect, because it was a part of the demonstration. Because generally speaking, the man was saying, well, you don't know anything in mathematics, and it is why you don't adopt the analytic point of view. Logic and mathematical logic was absolutely on the side of analytical point of view in the field of philosophy. And so it was a demonstration to say, I perfectly know the field of logic, mathematical logic and of mathematics, and inside this knowledge, this perfect knowledge of mathematics, I say something which is exactly contradictory to your position. So it was, it has been, in fact, a question for the enemies, analytic point of view. Because generally it was very simple to say, okay, but the French philosophy is something on the side of literature, interpretation, hermeneutics, something aesthetic, and so on. But they don't know the serious question, the question of science, so mathematics, question of logic, and so on. So you see, and it's also philosophy is always in the context, and it's always in the context of contradiction, of a fight, of a difficulty. And the subjectivity, the philosophical subjectivity, is also fighting subjectivity, and not a peaceful subjectivity. Kant is right. Philosophy is a battlefield, and we have explained why. We have tendencies, we have dialectical construction, you have oppositions, it's a necessity. And so my subjectivity was contradictory subjectivity. On one hand, it was order, mathematics, pure construction, demonstration, and all that, finally, in fighting subjectivity against the apparent victory of analytic tendencies in the academic context of France of the 80s. And the result is something like a book which is called a book which is really the form of a perfect form of construction with mathematics exactly at the place where mathematics must be, and so on. And you know, this book has been completely ignored when it was published. A complete failure. In France first, but also in other countries. The first recognition of the book has been in the United States. I must say that. And it's a strange situation for me. It was a necessity for me to love America. And I recognize my debt for you and many others, because in France it was a real failure. And it was a real failure for one reason, which is simple. It was a failure because it was impossible for the enemies to say something concerning this book, because the book was perfect in some sense. It was perfect not because it is true, but it was formulated. It was impossible to say Badiou does not know anything concerning logic, mathematics. No, it was impossible. And generally, I know much more than the enemies concerning that sort of thing. So it was impossible. So the good solution was to say nothing. And in fact, complete silence concerning the book. And so all that is inscribed in the history of a tactical failure, but a strategical victory, after all, by the American. Once more, an experience of the final victory is with the American people. The same thing against Hitler, after all. And so it has been a strange story. That is for the first. And the second book is completely different. In the second book, first, the second book is written when the first book has been recognized. We are not in the failure of the first publication, first appearance of the first book. We are in a completely different context, and I can write this book in a completely different subjectivity. A subjectivity which is much more free, much more anarchic. And I want to tell you a story. At the beginning of the new century, 10 years after the first book, I was naturally in the general idea of the second book. I perfectly knew that the second book was a book from the point of view of existence, and not from the point of view it was not my logic, like being an event, it was my phenomenology, to be Hegelian. So it was a book from the point of view of existence, and so the question was not the being of truth, but how a truth appears in a world. So it was the concrete appearance of the truth and not the formal being of a truth. And this is why my concept was the body of a truth, the materialist existence of the truth in a concrete world. If in the world all is body, we must have something like the concrete body of a truth. The truth must finally be also a form of objectivity. Not by itself, but finally, if truth exists, truth is also an object. Truth does not exist in another world, in the sky, and so on. Truth must exist concretely in the world. Well, this was my question. So a completely different question in some sense than the first question, which was the formal being of the truth. And when I began the book, I arrived in a strict order. It was completely false. I don't be in my true subjectivity. I repeat being an event, and it was impossible to write the book. The order was the same, existence, event, finality, subject, truth, and so on. And I was in complete despair, because it was impossible to write the book. The book was not good, and so on. And I have, during practically 1 year, I was in the idea to abandon the book. It was a crisis, a real crisis. And it was a philosophical crisis, because it was the idea that maybe it was impossible to write concerning the question of truth from the point of view of existence. But it was a very strong difficulty, because it is impossible to write concerning truth from the point of view of existence. Truth is something which does not exist. So truth is in another world. So we have, by necessity, something like a religious solution, a transcendent solution, a solution where truth is outside the world. And so it was a crisis of my fundamental materialism, because if a truth cannot exist in the world, and if I am a materialist, I must conclude that truth does not exist at all. Or I must conclude that truth exists in the sky of ideas, and I am a dualist, so finally I must recognize something like the existence of a God. So it was a profound crisis between my materialist subjectivity and the serious question of truth from the double point of view of being of truth and existence of truth. So I was in a crisis. And I was a possibility to go beyond the crisis by a pure experience. I think something near a mystic experience, in fact. I was in New York, under the snow. New York was absolutely white. Big snow, like completely in the silence of the town, because it was impossible to conduct car in the street, too much snow. So all white, all in the silence, and I was absolutely alone in really, suddenly, I have the vision of the book. It's true. It's really true. I have the vision of the book. And I understand that the construction of the book cannot be at all the construction of being an event. That I am in a false subjectivity. That I must transform my subjectivity and, for example, be much more in different examples, much more in a sort of disorder, appearance of disorder, and much more important, that I must begin by the question of the subject and not finish by the question of the subject, like in being an event. And so the existence of the subject must be affirmed at the beginning of the book and not at the end. And naturally, it was natural because if the point of departure is existence, it's a subjective point of departure. And so it's normal that the question of the subject is at the beginning. But I was in false subjectivity, and in the store of New York, I have had the vision, and after that, I have wrote the books in some months. It was no problem at all. The book was practically finished before I have written one line of the book, because the vision of the book was the solution of the problem. And it is why one reason for which I am not against mysticism, because I have had my mystic experience in the snow of New York. It's another American story. Not only the first book has been saved by American attention to the book, but the second exists because the mystic experience in New York. And I want now give you some experience of the difference between the two books, because after all it's an exercise concerning what I am saying too, the first beginning and the second beginning. So I shall read to you two lectures, one which is just after being an event, well, not just after being an event, and in the category of being an event, which is of 1994, and the second, which is after Logic of the World, which is 2007. So I do, I read the first, after that I give you the text, so you shall have the text, but it is necessary to do the copies and so on, to have the text. And tomorrow I shall read you the second lecture, not the text. It's just to have the perception of the difference, and so the perception of the two styles of philosophy, finally, inside my proper work. So, I read the first lecture of 1994. The title is The Ethic of Truths, Construction and Potency. And I not read the beginning, you will have. Modern philosophy is a criticism of truth as adequation. Truth is not adequatio rei et intellectus. Truth is not limited to the form of judgment. Hegel shows that truth is a path. Heidegger suggests that truth is an historic destiny. I will start from the following idea. A truth is, first of all, something new. What transmits, what repeats, we shall call knowledge. Distinguishing truth from knowledge is essential. It is a distinction which is already made in the work of Kant, the distinction between reason and understanding. It is a capital distinction for Heidegger, the distinction between truth, aletheia, and cognition or science, technique. If all truth is something new, what is the essential philosophic problem pertaining to truth? It is the problem of its appearance and its becoming. A truth must be submitted to thought not as a judgment, but as a process in the real. For the process of a truth to begin, something must happen. What there already is, the situation of knowledge as such, only gives us repetition. For a truth to affirm its newness, there must be a supplement. Just a commentary. In being an event, in fact, the event is conceived as not only as a cut in the situation, but as a supplement of the situation, in something which is near Derrida by some aspects. So, for a truth to affirm its newness, there must be a supplement. This supplement is committed to chance. It is unpredictable, uncalculable. It is beyond what is. I call it an event. A truth appears in its newness because an eventful supplement interrupts repetition. Well, it's a recapitulation of all concepts. Examples. The appearance with Aeschylus of theatrical tragedy. The irruption with Galileo of mathematical physics. An amorous encounter which changed the whole life of the French Revolution of 1892. An event is linked to the notion of the undecidable. Take the utterance, this event belongs to the situation. If you can, using the rule of established knowledge, decide that this utterance is true or false, the event will not be an event. It will be calculable within the situation. Nothing permits us to say, here begins the truth. A wager will have to be made. This is why the truth begins with an axiom of truth. It begins with a decision. The decision to say that the event has taken place. The fact that the event is undecidable imposes the constraint that the subject of the event must appear. Such a subject is constituted by an utterance in the form of a veil. This utterance is as follows: this has taken place, that I can neither calculate nor demonstrate, but to which I shall be faithful. So, the question of the event, in being an event, is directly in correlation to the subject. The event exists, naturally, but we have no proof and no demonstration of that sort of existence. What is the only attestation, the only proof of the event is the decision of a subject, of a new subject. A decision of a subject who say, this has taken place, the event is real, the event is real. I can neither calculate nor demonstrate this point, but I shall be faithful to my decision. A subject is, to begin with, what fixes an undecidable event. A subject is what fixes an undecidable event because it takes the chance of deciding it. This engages the infinite procedure of verification of the truth. So, you see, the beginning of the truth is a decision, and the process of the truth is the verification of this decision. We cannot have any guarantee at the beginning. The guarantee is retroactive. The guarantee is the verification of my decision is really a true decision, is in the consequences of the decision and not is the decision by itself. This is why we have the infinite procedure of verification of the truth. It's the examination within the situation of the consequences of the action which decided the event. It's the exercise of fidelity. Nothing regulates its course since the axiom which supports it are arbitrated outside of any rule of established knowledge. All that is outside any rule, any fixed rule in the situation itself. So we have no knowledge which is the orientation of the process. We are only in the consequences of the pure first decision. It is then a hazardous course or a course without a consensus. So the process of the truth is a process without consensus. But what is a pure choice? A choice without a concept. It's obviously a choice confronted by two indiscernible terms. Two terms are indiscernible, is no effect of language permits their distinction. But if no formula of language discerns two terms of the situation, it is certain that the choice of having the verification pass by one rather than the other, but the choice of having the verification pass by one rather than the other, can find no support in the objectivity of their difference. It is then an absolutely pure choice, free from any other presupposition than having to choose, with no indication marking the proposed term, the one by which the verification of the consequences of the action will first pass. All that is very important. The event happens, but in some sense it's a subject. We are saying that the event happens. So it's a decision. After that sort of decision, we have a process of verification, term by term of the decision. But there is no knowledge in the situation to orient the choice. Because if you have a knowledge in the situation to orient the choice, the event is not an event. It's something which is a part of of the rational situation. So we are confronted after an event or to a succession of pure choices. Pure choices which are not irrational, but we are not included in the form of knowledge inside the situation, so inside the world. So there is something where we must decide without any guarantee of that sort of decision. You know? And it's a succession of choices which create a sort of process, but that sort of process is without any guarantee in the knowledge of the situation. This means that the subject of a truth demands the indiscernible. The indiscernible organizes the pure point of the subject in the process of verification. A subject is what disappears between two indiscernibles. The definition of the subject. The subject is a pure choice, so the choice between two terms which are indiscernible, and the subject is its proper disparition by the choice of one term against the other. So a subject is what disappears between two indiscernibles. A subject is the throw of the dice which does not abolish chance, but accomplishes it as a verification of the action which founds it. What was decided concerning the undecidable event must pass by this term, indiscernible from its other. So we must decide, but we must decide between two indiscernible terms, and we decide in the form of our conviction that the consequences of the indiscernible event must pass by this term. For example, the world of Sophocles is a subject for this artistic truth the Greek tragedy is. Truth begun by the event of Aeschylus. This work is creation, pure choice in what, before it, is indiscernible. And it is a finite work. However, tragedy itself, as artistic truth, continues unto infinity. The work of Sophocles is the finite subject of this infinite truth, finite subject of this infinite truth. In the same way, the scientific truth decided by Galileo is pursued unto infinity. But the laws of physics, which have been successively invented, are finite subjects of this truth. We continue with the process of the truth. It began by an undecidable event. It finds its act in a finite subject confronted by the indiscernible. This verifying course continues. It invests the situation with successive choices. That is the point. And we can experiment all that. For example, in the course of love, of truth love, we have successive choices. The construction of the truth is always in the form of successive choices. And there is no determination of this succession of choice. If you have a determination, we are not in the process of construction of something new. I return to the beginning of the text. A truth is fundamentally something new, which is not reducible to the pure context of situation. And why this construction is the construction of something new is because it's not determined by the situation. If it was determined by the situation, naturally it was not something new in the situation. So we must absolutely include in the definition of the truth that the truth is constructed by a succession of choices which are not simply the execution of a determination inside the situation. And this is why the progressive construction of truth is something in relationship with pure chance. Chance of the event and successive chance of pure choices without any complete determination. And I think you can refer to your experiences of participation to the truth in your life, in political engagement, in acceptation of law of passion, of the effect of a work of art, and so on, to understand the point. Really, in any case, we have to do choices, and that sort of choice is not determined by the terms of the choice. So there is something like a pure or instinctive choice, which is in the dependency of the primitive event, and which is a choice to be faithful to the event by the choice itself. Maybe it's a correct choice, maybe not. That is the point. We cannot have primitive certitude concerning the correctness of the choice, but we must do the choice. And it's the possibility of that sort of accumulation of choices which progressively is a deployment in the situation, which is the construction of truth. Little by little, the contour of a subset of the situation is outlined by the construction of successive choices. In this subset of the situation, the eventful axiom verifies its effects. It is clear that this subset is infinite, that it remains unterminable. Yet it can be stated that if we suppose it be ended, it will be ineluctably a subset that no predicates unifies, an untotalizable subset. It is the most difficult point. The idea is that by successive choices, we construct something new in the situation. We are in the situation, we are not in the sky. The construction of the truth is a terrestrial one. So we are in the situation and we construct by successive choice something new. Something new from an ontological point of view is purely and simply a subset of the situation. It's a collection of elements of the situation. Because we are not something outside the situation, we are inside. So truth is finally something like a subset of the situation. But this subset cannot be resumed or named by a word of the situation. Because if it was the case, this subset would not be new. If, for example, the subset is the subset which is the subset of cats in the situation, the subset of table, the subset of so on, naturally it's not something new. If we have a name in the situation to designate the new subset, the subset is not new, because it was a subset which was recognized before the event itself in the situation by a name. So the subset is new only if it is without name. So, which is a subset which is not recognized in the situation from the point of view of knowledge. And that sort of, and it's easy to understand that a subset which is constructed by successive pure choices cannot be a subset which is in the knowledge of the situation. Because if you have a succession of pure choices, we have no determination in the knowledge, and so we have no name in the knowledge for this subset. So there is a relationship between the succession of free choices and the construction of the truth as a subset of the situation, which is a subset without any reference in the knowledge. And it is why a truth cannot be a part of knowledge. But for that, we have to accept that the truth is constructed by a succession of free choices. And maybe the most simple, the simplest example is the case of law. The event is a pure encounter between somebody and somebody. One day there is an encounter with somebody. The decision that it is an event is a declaration. For example, the declaration, I love you. I love you, what is the signification of something like that? It's exactly the decision that the encounter with somebody is an event, and not only something which is in the laws of the situation. It's something absolutely new in your life, and the translation of that is always a declaration. So, a declaration, it's a decision, we know that. We are in the hypothesis that it's the true decision and not a false decision. You are not saying I love you immediately for sexual reasons and so on. Okay, it's a true encounter, and you have a decision. But after that, we must construct something which is the real of the law, and we perfectly know by our experience that we have to do for that some free choices, a succession of choices, very important concerning sexuality, organization, a child, and so on and so on. All that must be decided, and naturally, there is not in the situation a knowledge which authorizes that sort of choice. You must invent the law of the choice. The law of the choice does not exist. And finally, you construct a subset of the situation, which is the real effect of your love, and as a subset which is without any name in the situation. So, you have an abstract name, it's a law, but a name of this concrete law does not exist, naturally. And maybe you invent also a name. Our law is named in a different manner. And that is the truth. The truth is constantly under this paradigm, an event, a decision concerning this event, a succession of free choices, the construction of a subset, and the subset is a subset without name, a subset which is not included in the knowledge of situation. And not only is not named in the situation, is not in the knowledge, but it cannot be in the knowledge, because it is the result of successive free choices without any law, any existent law in the situation itself. And that sort of subset is, in this sense, a generic set. It was the central concept of being an event, the concept of generic set. A generic set is a set which is not included in the knowledge of the subset of the situation. In that sense, it's really a new subset in the situation, which is without place in the knowledge, and which is something like a supplement to the situation. And that is the solution of the problem of the solution of the problem of what is the being of a truth. The being of a truth is a generic set. So, being an event was a problem and the complete solution of the problem. So we stop here. I have read only a part of the text, but I give the text to my slave here. Okay, my slave is here. So you take the text and you give it to